Okay, remember. Okay, remember that they're changing my voice. There was once three tribal nations. They were right next to each other. And they had all the technologies that we have here in America right now. A wave of anarchy hit them all at the same time. And luckily for them, after a while, they brought back order. In one nation, they had a tribal chief, a monarchy. In another nation, they had a capitalist government. And in the last nation, they had a socialist government. In all three of these nations, the top 1% had hoarded the money. You know, the food, the materials. They owned lots of these things. They owned 80% at least, and the other 99% in these nations, it was about the same in these nations, they owned only 20%. People were in the streets. People were hungry. Inflation was high. It was an ugly situation in all three of these nations. The chief of the nation that had a chief or a king, what have you, he says to the other ones, the answer is very simple. You simply take at least 20% of the wealth of the 1%, and over time at a rate that won't cause too much trouble, for good measure, you redistribute that 20%. Okay, so when you're done, the top 1% will have somewhere around 60% instead of 80% of the wealth, and the bottom 99%, okay, will have 40% instead of 20. So instead of an 80-20 split, it'll be a 60-40 split, where the 1% has the 60% and the 99% has the 40%. All three of those nations agreed. They redistributed over time with an emphasis on essential services, shelter, food, and healthcare. A lot of the money was in assets, so they gave the people around 1% of the stock of various companies. And keep in mind, the rich had enough money to buy back the stock themselves. They still had plenty of money. Okay, in a lot of these cases, it's only 1% of their business. So it didn't increase market volatility. It didn't make it so that there would be serious repercussions on the corporation or the economy in general. Now, the moral of this story is that it is insane, just crazy, to not pass the War on Poverty plan. In my plan, you're redistributing 10% in 30 to 40 years. The first year, $220 billion in new taxes goes out. There's no need for people to, own stock instead of receive government services as a result. It's cost-effective spending. It's open and shut. Now, some of you'll look at the trickle-down economics theory, right, the supply side, the argument that if you give the rich $4.5 trillion in tax breaks, then magically everything will be better. Well, there's several problems with this. One, this has been tried before. In fact, the reason why we have like $36 trillion in debt is because we've been doing supply-side economics heavily since at least Reagan. We see in the 70s and the 80s, the thinking was moving towards supply-side economics. Nixon and Reagan both thought of it more that way. Reaganomics. And over time, as various leftists try to pass certain policies, it didn't counterbalance the overwhelmingly supply side economic activities that were taking place that made the system in the last 40, 50 years a system that is best described as a trickle-down economic system at any given point under Biden, under Obama, under Clinton, you name it, and certainly under Republicans. At any given point in the last 45 years, the systems has been a supply-side economic system. Just because they haven't given them 100% tax breaks or something the whole time doesn't mean it's not supply-side economics. Going back to the trouble, the problem with the argument of the 4.5 trillion. First of all, why 4.5? Why 4.5 trillion? Why not 4.4 or 4 or 3.5? For example, if you made it 4 trillion instead of 4.5 trillion, you could take $100 billion, $100 billion, and invest it in the smartest college graduates, okay, the wisest and the best who aren't rich people. So they can start companies, and you can tell the general public what companies those are so they can support them. Rich people aren't the only ones who can make money. You can take the other $400 billion and build lots of tiny homes and apartments and start a massive farming program with like $200 billion. The results, when you compare the model and the projected outcomes of the two models, would be much more favorable to the American people at large. Homelessness would end. Poverty would be all but solved in America. Opportunities would spring up. You could also use some of that money to hire more police officers, to make the streets safer, to make it easier for people to climb out of the position they're in. It's harder to rise when the streets are full of crime because they steal your car, they steal your things, they beat you up, they send you to the hospital, they send your kids to the hospital. Now you got hospital bills, and they have to buy a new car, and so on and so forth. Now housing prices go up. Now the city has less money for city services because they have to hire new police officers without a budget to do so, without new funding to do so. When you look at the domino effect of supply-side economics, it is like dropping a bomb on that country, with an emphasis on the flesh of the poor and the souls of the rich. Thank you.